Welcome back, everyone. I'm Sarah Peck, and this is the Startup Pregnant Podcast. October 1st. Today is a really special day because it actually has been 12 months since we launched the Startup Pregnant Podcast. We are officially 1 year old. We put our first episodes together. I remember I filed them in iTunes September 24th, September 27th, September 29th, because we were trying to get those 4 episodes up all at the same time and get the approval process and get everything figured out. Well, we're here. We've done it. We have been making podcast episodes weekly for the last year, and I am kind of astonished that just over a year ago, it was only an idea. And now it feels like something that is truly a part of my life. So first of all, happy birthday to the podcast. And thank you, everybody that is a sponsor of the podcast and an avid listener of the podcast. And if you want to give us a birthday present, you know what I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you to leave us a review on iTunes because people, when they go and they look at the podcast, they say, well, should I listen to this? Let me sample a little bit and let me see what other people have said. So if this podcast is doing it for you, go leave us a review. We would really appreciate that. Many of you know that I am about to head into newborn land with baby number 2. We are set to add our second kid to our family at some point in mid-October. And we've been hard at work over the summer here on the podcast, getting interviews ready and prepped in advance. Now, if you want to know when exactly the baby is coming, the human baby is coming, you can, if you're part of our Facebook group or you follow us on Instagram, I will definitely share when our baby gets here. So one crazy fun fact is, do you know how many babies are born each day around the world? I looked it up because I was curious. There are 353,000 babies born every day around the world. So if you put that into minutes or seconds, there's 4.3 births every second. 4 babies every second. That's incredible. So we've got one of those babies coming into our lives at some point in October. But as you know, babies come at any point, and we're recording this so far in advance that maybe the baby is here and they arrived in middle of September, or maybe they're going to stick around until late October and make their arrival whenever they do. One of the things we're doing to prep is getting all these interviews ready in advance. We've got shows with some amazing guests pre-recorded for the fall and the winter season up ahead. And in November, I'm doing a special series with a dear friend of mine, Carrie Fortin, all about how I prepped for my maternity leave as an entrepreneur, how I've designed this business in particular to mesh with having babies and make it work, what's changed across all of this, and so many more good conversations. So that special series is coming in November. We've got all these interviews coming for you in the rest of the fall and winter. My baby is coming. This podcast is 1 year old, and you can leave us a review on iTunes. That would be the best birthday present for all of us, for the podcast, for the baby, for everything. Now let's talk about today's guest. Today we have a guest that I have been a huge fan of for a really long time. Asha Dornfest is a writer, a podcaster, and a community organizer. She wrote this book called Parent Hacks. She's also the co-author of many other books and has written like 8 or 9 books at this point. But this book, Parent Hacks, is one of my favorite books ever. If you don't know this book or this blog, Parent Hacks is such a treat. It's a way to rethink common everyday tools and hack your way into parenting. And I personally send it out as a present to most of the people that I know that are having kids, because it's a little tiny book and it's illustrated and it's got all these visuals of how to make it work as a new parent when you're like, why am I drowning in so much stuff? I get such a crack up about the book. She is also the co-author of the book Minimalist Parenting, and she's the co-host of the Edit Your Life podcast. She's based in Portland, Oregon. In today's episode, we're going to talk about what it was like for her to launch the blog Parent Hacks over a decade ago and why blogs were so important community building devices when she launched Parent Hacks. We're going to talk about our specific favorite hacks for getting through parenting and what spurred her into a life of less and this philosophy of minimalism that she carries. And then I get to ask her about how her life has changed from having little ones, little tiny ones, to having school-aged kids. And now her kid is going off to college. And I ask her about the parenting journey across all those time periods. It's such a great conversation, and I cannot wait to share it with you. Welcome to the Startup Pregnant Podcast, where we talk to creative leaders about what it means to be an entrepreneur and a parent. I'm your host, Sarah K. Peck. You know when you get an email and someone is like, yeah, let's meet. Does Thursday work? And you write back, actually, Friday's better. And then you end up in this kind of email back and forth that is never ending. And just when you find the right time, you realize that you accidentally overbooked that time because of some other email thread back and forth that took forever. Yeah, we have to stop that. Our friends at Acuity Scheduling are super helpful with this, and they are the sponsors of today's episode. So head to acuityscheduling.com/startuppregnant, and you will get a free 45-day trial to check them out. All right, everyone. I am so excited to welcome Asha Dornfest to the show. Asha, welcome and thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
I have so many questions to ask you, and I feel like you are on the other end of the wisdom curve. Like you have all of this great knowledge to share. So I'm going to ask you so many questions. Can you start by telling me, what time did you wake up this morning, and what was the first thing you did?
Okay, so of course you have to ask me on the day that I woke up at 4 a.m. for no reason. I'm very much a morning person. So, I'm a person who can fall asleep pretty much at 9:30 or 10 p.m. no matter what is going on around me. And then I wake up early in the morning. But generally what I do when I wake up, like around 5 a.m. or so, is the first thing is starting the coffee. And the next thing is reading the newspaper. I actually just did something sort of wonderful for my brain, which was I got rid of my online news apps. I was reading my news online and I resubscribed to the paper newspaper. And it's really helping me sort of moderate my phone use, which has been great. So I really start the day with coffee and the news. And then I try to sort of sit with my calendar and the day's appointments and, tasks and just sort of arrange what I'm doing, because it seems like every day is different around here. There's always a dog walk in the morning, but, my mornings are much more geared toward just sort of living my life rather than anything kid related these days, because my kids are growing up.
Yeah. So how old are your kids, and do they have any part of your morning routine? Is there still school schedules? What does that look like?
Well, my kids are 18 and 15. So my 18-year-old son just graduated from high school and will be leaving for college, like in less than 2 months. And my daughter is going to become a sophomore in high school next year. So there is still a very light morning routine in that it is very hard for teenagers to wake up in the morning. So the routine is, waking them up and getting them out of bed. But beyond that, they do their thing. They get themselves to school and they sort of figure out what their day and their structure looks like. I think in many ways, there's so many joys about having teenagers, but one of the great joys is that you can see certain arcs coming to fruition. And one of them is, I've really been trying to encourage them to be independent for a long, long time. And I'm seeing that play out now. Not perfectly, for sure. I mean, there are things that my kids don't do that other kids do and all that stuff. It's not like it's some, perfect situation, but it is so heartening and it just fills you with joy and pride when you see your kids just doing their thing, living their lives and becoming who they are.
So I have to ask you, what is it like to be on the precipice of having a kid go off to college? Like, what's happening emotionally, psychologically? What does that feel like for you?
Oh, boy. It changes day to day. So if you would have asked me this on the day my son made his final decision and we paid the deposit for college, and the reality of his moving out of state really, it was just concrete at that moment. For the next 48 hours, I was just sort of wandering around in a haze, and it was really hard. It was scary to sort of think, oh my gosh, there's an ending date now in terms of, when he's living with us. So that was tough. It was just sort of this joy and loss at the same time. And I've never experienced a feeling like that before. But since then, we're now sort of getting into it and thinking about it. Now I'm just excited about it for him. I'm so proud and excited about these decisions that he's making. it's sort of interesting. It's sort of like when you're pregnant in some ways. You have all of these thoughts about what it's going to be like, but you can't really know until you're there, until your baby has arrived. And I have a feeling that everything that I even say right now at this moment, it's just going to be 100% different on the day that he actually moves out. And so I think the difference for me now is that I've really learned to just sort of live in the moment and trust that what's going to happen is going to happen. And I can get as prepared as I can in terms of, the logistics and getting this stuff packed and buying the dorm supplies. But as for emotionally preparing, I don't know if that's really possible. I think that I've gotten more comfortable with just experiencing what happens as it happens rather than trying to protect myself from what's going to happen.
Yeah, that makes so much sense because people keep asking me, I'm at the time of this recording, I'm currently pregnant with our second kiddo, and they keep asking me what the fall is going to be like and what the winter is going to be like and how I'm planning ahead. And the first time I got pregnant, I wanted it. I planned ahead for it. We did the stuff to do to get pregnant. And then I got pregnant and I crashed into depression and fear and anxiety. And I couldn't have ever known that that was going to be the feeling I was going to have.
Oh, boy. Do I understand? And, I'm with you on that. Right. The unpredictability of parenting and life in general. But, if you sort of look at it through the lens of parenting is just amazing. That doesn't show up in the books that you read or the stories that people tell. I think it does more now because people are more comfortable being a little more open about what it's really like. And I think blogs really helped with that, years ago. But it's true. We can't predict how we're going to feel. We can't predict who this little person is going to be, how they're going to come out, what they need. And I sometimes say it's a little bit of a joke, but it's also 100% serious, which is that one of the reasons parenting gets easier as the years go on is not because you've somehow gotten better at it. It's more like it's because you know your kid better. You have literally spent more years with this person, so you know them better. And so therefore, it's easier to be a parent to that person. And I think I feel more comfortable with that now. I didn't feel comfortable with that before because I felt like I needed to prepare and I needed to be, I'm an A student and I prepare for things.
Yes.
That had always worked for me before. Yeah. And it didn't work for me with parenting, which is not to say we shouldn't prepare. Of course we should prepare. But then, if things go sideways or if things turn out a little differently than expected, it doesn't mean we've done something wrong.
Oh, this is so interesting. So can you take us back in time? I would love to know more about your parenting journey in the early days. Have you always known that you wanted to have kids? And what was it like in those early days when you were first starting out?
Well, it's interesting. I write about those early days in the introduction to my book, Parent Hacks, because the reason I started that blog way back when in 2005 was exactly because my early parenting journey was so unpredictable and not what I expected it to be. So, you asked if I've always wanted to have kids. Absolutely, I've always wanted to have kids. In a sort of a theoretical sense, I did not have a plan or a timeline or anything like that. But it was like, yeah, I want to have kids someday. That said, my husband and I were married for 6 years before we had our son. So there was lots of adult married working time before my son came along in 1999. And so what that did was it sort of cemented this idea for me that my adult life was in my control. I made choices about how I spent my time and what I wanted to do for my job and, what my husband and I were going to do at, 6 p.m. on a Thursday night. And so when my son arrived and, we tried for a time to have him, he came along. Birth was a little complicated, but everybody was healthy. But those early months of parenting, this little baby just didn't act like what I had read about in all of the books that I had read, because like I said, A student, I studied before the kid arrived and I had it all figured out. We all have it all figured out before the kid arrives, right? So, my experience parenting this little person who cried a lot, who didn't want to sleep, who just acted differently than all of my friends' babies, I just assumed it's because I was doing something wrong. I either hadn't read the right book or I was not implementing what I had read properly. And so not only did that lead to, me feeling terrible about myself, it brought a lot of strain to my relationships, my marriage. It was just like suddenly everything was different. And so it was a struggle. It was a hard transition. Even though this like crushing love for this child just, was with me every step of the way. So yeah, it was a tough transition. And what I'm talking about now and how settled things seem now has really been this 18-year journey. And, a big part of that was, believe it or not, launching a blog in 2005. By that time, my son was already, he's heading into kindergarten. So it was a tough few years. And, he was a challenging toddler and, a challenging preschooler. And so I started this blog called Parent Hacks as a way to basically just swap tips with other parents, because I found that the advice that I got from other parents was always so much more useful, or at least more comforting than what I was reading in the books. I felt really abandoned by the books and the experts. I think where we are, in 2018, it's not that I want to knock experts, because I very much believe in science and medical expertise. I do believe in these things, but I also really believe in the wisdom that comes from experience. And I think what I've learned at this point is that children are individuals, and also families have their own sets of values. And those factors really come into play when you're making decisions about something as simple as what to feed your kid or how to put your kid to sleep or anything else that you have to figure out when you're a parent.
How did the name Parent Hacks, how was it born? Where did it come from?
Oh, well, that's actually a fun story because so I've been a writer for years before I was a parent, and both my husband and I were involved in internet related stuff and websites and things, web design, which is sort of a big deal because that started in like the mid 90s. And in the mid 90s, there weren't really many websites. And so one of my first books was writing about HTML and how to create a website. So we were sort of old school internet people. And at the time, my husband was working for a company called O'Reilly Media, wonderful, wonderful tech publisher based in the Bay Area. And they had a series of programming books called the Hacks series. And it was all about this notion that, there are the rules of a programming language, and then there are all those hacks, those tricks and, duct tape type tips that you put into practice to get something to work that doesn't exactly fit the conventional rules. And so, this idea of hacks was sort of in my mind from that context. And at one point, my husband and I were talking, and I was saying, there should be a parenting hacks, because parenting isn't like any of the rules that you read about in the books either. Like you sometimes just have to, figure out something really creative to get to the end of the day. That's where the name Parent Hacks came from. So it just so happened that I started Parent Hacks. At that time, the term hacks wasn't as commonly used, but there was a site called Lifehacker, and Lifehacker was huge at that time. So Parent Hacks was one of the first, I guess you could say, verticals that really focused on one specific group of people and set of tips for that group of people. I mean, that makes it sound like I had actually thought ahead and, had a plan, but of course I didn't. I was just creating what I myself needed, the community that I felt that I needed, that I wasn't finding around me at the time.
Mm-hmm. I think that's such an interesting point, because it can be hard to remember that 15 to 20 years ago, there weren't social media groups and blogs in the same way. Like you really did rely on books so much more for the expertise. And that can come with a lot of loneliness. I think there's a different type of loneliness today for parenting for sure, but I'm just putting my head around this.
Well, that's so true. And it's funny now when I tell this story, it really is dated at this point because, at that time, there was no sort of online place like Facebook or anything else to just say, hey, you guys, what did you do when your kid did this? There was no way to do that. There were news groups. I don't know if you remember Usenet news groups. And there were forums on places like Baby Center. And those were actually amazing. I mean, amazing communities grew out of those forums, but those were pretty specialized. From those forums, a lot of that conversation moved into the comment sections of blogs. And that's what happened with my blog back in 2005, 2006. Those were pretty great years because other parents had started also using blogs to connect with each other, share their experiences, and the amazing conversations that would happen between readers and writers. Unlike with a book, there's this massive gulf between the person who wrote the book and then the person who's reading the book, right? Usually the person who wrote the book is, this doctor or an expert or something. It's a sort of a one-way thing. Blogs were very much a two-way thing. And the line between writer and reader so faint. And it was a wonderful time to be able to actually connect with people and say, oh my gosh, I am not alone. I am not alone in this. And I really did feel alone in my offline life. I just felt like my friends' kids weren't doing what my kid was doing. Some of my, friends and acquaintances actually judged us for, the way he was and the way his personality was and his habits. And it was such a hard time. So being online at that time actually was wonderful and connecting. And I think you're right. Now, being online can lead to a little more loneliness. I mean, which is not to say there isn't still magic on the internet. I believe that there is, but you have to be more intentional about finding it.
So the book, the Parent Hacks book, which I have many copies of, it seems like it got published over 10 years after the blog. Can you talk about the process of going from blog to book and what that looked like?
Okay, isn't that crazy? 10 years?
Yeah. Is that right? Am I getting that right?
Yes.
With it? Okay.
Absolutely, you're right. So it was just one of those serendipitous, wonderful things that happened in the world. So launched Parent Hacks in 2005. It, grew a real thriving community throughout the mid 2000s, late 2000s. And then, as social media took off, really the need for a blog like Parent Hacks, it sort of waned. It was, nearing its useful life because another way to connect with parents and swap tips and all that stuff came around, basically social media. And, and that's when just mainstream folks came online and started talking to each other. And that was fine with me. Like, for me, Parent Hacks was always meant to be useful and meant to be sort of service. And so the fact that people weren't using blogs as much, I mean, that was fine. So I had opportunities to write books based on Parent Hacks over the years, and I'd always turn those down because I felt like Parent Hacks wasn't as much the tips as it was the community and the conversation. And you can't reflect that so much in a book, or you couldn't back then. Many years later, basically now, I was approached by Workman Publishing, which is an incredible, wonderful publisher. They actually publish What to Expect When You're Expecting. But the other thing about Workman that makes them amazing is they publish they're really special books. Like they're more like objects, objects to interact with rather than just straight up books, illustrated, interesting design, interesting, package, shape, everything about it. And they approached me and said, would you consider writing a Parent Hacks book? The book actually was published in 2016. When they approached me, that was the moment when I was sort of thinking about Parent Hacks and this amazing trove of tips that I had contributed by thousands of parents literally across the world. And I wanted to honor that because I created the space, but it's the parents who sent me their tips. A lot of times, in the years before cell phones, they didn't have camera phones. They didn't have email on their phones. They would take a picture with a camera and get that picture onto their computer and then sit down and write me an email. I mean, it took time for people to contribute. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to honor all of that time and care, and it was their effort that made it. So I felt like a book would turn this blog into something physical and tangible, something people could look at and page through and give to their friends as gifts and just say, hey, I was part of that. So that was what really, really said, okay, yes, I want to write this book. And so then, from there, the greatest thing Workman did, I mean, obviously, besides giving me the opportunity, was they found the most wonderful illustrator. I'm a word person. I'm not a graphic person. So what they did was they turned Parent Hacks, the sort of cream of the crop of these tips, into these really fun visual little tidbits. And it's just the greatest thing. So I spent a lot of time, had a lot of help from actually one of my longtime contributors, Adrienne. She helped go through the 4,000 posts to try to find, the good tips, many times digging through comments. I mean, it was quite a process, let me tell you. And we, just narrowed it down and I wrote this book.
The curation, I'm sure, just takes so much time. I think the illustrations really are so magical because when you're a sleep-deprived, exhausted new parent with a 6-month-old or a 1-year-old, reading can be hard. Your eyes just glaze over. And there are all of these beautiful, on grid dot paper, just big crayon-like drawings of all of these different hacks. And you just get it instantly without having to do the translation that words to images requires in your brain, which is such a useful hack for parents.
Yes, indeed. And so, again, this is one of the great things that Workman understands as a publisher, as a creator of books and art. they understand that. And the illustrator that they found to work with me, his name is Creighton Berman, and he is a dad himself. He totally gets it, not just from the artistic standpoint, but from his own life. And he also happens to be a really great guy. I sing this man's praises every time I can because it was just such a joy to work with him. And the illustrations, I mean, they're very clever. This is not a cutesy book. It is a clever, I mean, the art is really great. And the design, the art paired with the design really is great. So yeah, I mean, I think, if Parent Hacks were to happen in 2018, it would absolutely be an Instagram account. I mean, the visuals are really what make it. But the beauty of the fact that I started it when I did meant that that community had a chance to really start and grow. And that was, for me, just personally, I'm not talking about me as a blogger or me as a publisher. I'm talking about me as a parent, as a human. That was what I personally needed. It just gave so much to me that way.
Because we have so many parents listening and so many people transitioning into the world of parenthood, I have to ask you what some of your favorites or long-standing hacks are. So for people listening, what are some of the hacks that have really, either they make you giggle or they've changed your life in some way?
Oh, man. It's like, I really should prepare for this question because everyone asks me and then I'm like,
I could tell you mine to start us off if you want.
Okay. Just you tell me yours first. It will jog my memory.
Okay. So the one that really helped me in particular, it seems so simple, but the baby registry issue of like what you should put on your baby registry is a real mental trap, I think, for parents to be. It like gets you into this kind of crazy consumption of stuff space. So I'll tell you actually a little story before I get into the hack, but we live in New York City in a super tiny apartment. We have no backyard, no garage, and no closet space. When we wrote our announcement for having a baby, we told all of our friends and family in the nicest, most direct, blunt way possible to not dare to get us anything off the registry list. Because if they did, it would go straight to the garbage. I think that was on my baby announcement. Just because, like, if somebody got us a big bounceroo or like one of those little sports cars for kids, I couldn't have it in my house. There would be no room. We'd probably have a broken arm as a result. So,
and then returning it is a whole huge thing too.
No, I can't even. So there was one person who sent us something that was not on the list. That person was one of my husband's cousins, and he sent us the book Parent Hacks.
Oh, yeah.
So he went against the grain and it showed up and I was like very skeptical at first. I was like, this was not on the list. This was not on the list. And I looked at it and I said, you know what? You just won. You got us a gift that we didn't know we needed and it's small and I appreciate it. So inside of it.
That's a great story.
Yeah. Isn't it great? And now I've sent the book to like 20 different people. So it's a tool in our house that we love. But so inside of it, the hack that I love, speaking of baby registries, is the laundry basket as a bathtub one.
Oh, yeah. There's a reason that's on the cover. It's genius.
You don't need a specialized bathtub. You just need a receptacle that holds water.
Mm-hmm.
And chances are you already have a bucket that looks like a laundry basket, as long as your laundry basket doesn't have holes in it. But even if it does, if it can hold 4 inches of water, there's your baby bathtub. And those kind of insights and ahas where you get to look at the stuff you already have and repurpose it, I mean, they're so satisfying to me.
Oh, so satisfying. I mean, some people use like large Rubbermaid tubs, which when their baby outgrows the tub, they use it to store holiday decorations or whatever. So yes, exactly. First of all, thank you for that great story about the book. I have another funny story about the book. If we have time, I'll tell you. But you did ask me what my favorite hacks are.
Yes.
And I've been looking through the book, and some of these hacks are mine. Most come from other parents. But I'm just going to tell you the one that actually made the biggest difference in my life. And that was to stash extra pacifiers in the corner of the crib. So my kid, he needed his pacifier to go to sleep and then to stay asleep. And then it would fall out and then he'd cry and I'd come in and put it back in. And that happened multiple times per night. Well, there came a time when we figured out that if we've got exact duplicates of the pacifier, stuck them in the corners of the crib, at a certain point, he became old enough to sort of flail his hand around and find one and stick it in his mouth. Now, it wasn't an immediate fix. It was an eventual fix. And that allowed us to sleep. And as you know, sleep is the foundation of everything else in your life.
It brings you back towards sanity, just closer to it. Yes.
Yeah. Well, the other thing about that is even before he could reach and pop one in his mouth, even when he was still waking up, and we had to do it for him, we could stumble into his room, be half asleep, and know that there was a pacifier sitting there. We wouldn't have to like go rabbling around and if it fallen on the floor. So it was always there. We could just do it quickly. So anyway, that actually really helped me. And there's another actually very funny list in the book, and it's 7 pretend games you can play while lying down. As I said, my son didn't really want to sleep a lot as a toddler or whatever, just didn't really want to nap. There were times when I would lie on the floor and I would say, okay, I'm going to wrap myself in this blanket and I'm a caterpillar in the cocoon and I'm going to become a butterfly. And even 30 seconds of lying on the floor wrapped in a blanket helped me feel better. Like it was a way to play while also being able to rest. I mean, it's not much, but it helped. Okay.
30 seconds of shut-eye time under a blanket while your kid is giggling can be like a moment that shifts the course of the day.
Oh, yeah. It was really great. And some of the other pretend games that are here are pretty funny, including one that somebody sent in. They play tattoo artist. Now, that sounds really freaky until you actually figure out what it is, which is this person would take their shirt off, lie on the floor, face down, and let their kid draw on their back with washable markers.
You know, that actually sounds kind of great. That sounds like I get to lie down, and you might even get like a little tactile stimulation or massage-like effect.
Exactly.
Oh. So one of the things I love about the spirit or the ethos of this book is that it combines this like minimalism approach or an ethos of simplicity and reduction. Like it's not about just accumulating more, but it's about doing interesting, clever things with what you have and making your life a little bit easier. Is this a philosophy you've had for a long time? And if so, where do you think it came from?
It's definitely a philosophy I've had for a long time. And I would love to tell you it's because I have some sort of Zen approach to life and my house is perfectly,
Mine too.
Okay. You know where I'm going with this. The real answer to that is threefold. The first is that I'm really cheap. Okay. I just don't like to buy stuff. I don't like buying things and I don't like spending money on things. I like reusing things. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that my husband is a super neat and tidy guy. And so he was the one who was like, we can't have a bunch of stuff sitting around. I mean, he's really the one. I am a person who piles things in the corner and has a hard time keeping my dresser drawers organized. That's just me. He, on the other hand, is super organized. And so his sort of constant influence in our life made it much easier to avoid buying things or buy the smallest thing or, you know what I mean? That basically took up the least amount of real estate or visual space in our house. The third part of that was my family. My dad's from India. And so I didn't spend a lot of time in India as a child, but I spent time there as an adult before I had kids. And I saw my family there taking care of kids in incredibly skilled, wonderful ways. And there wasn't all that stuff. And it just didn't seem necessary. And so it was also this like logical part of my brain that was like, really, you can't really need all of these things. So there was also that. It was sort of an intellectual, exercise as well. So yeah, I mean, I think the fact is parent hacks taken from that minimalism, reuse it sort of perspective totally just fit in with who I am and how I live my life.
That's so interesting how you unpacked it and where the drivers are. Because I know that a lot of people can have similar philosophies, but they can be driven by different kind of impulses or driving forces. That's so interesting.
I started Parent Hacks before social media. There were no Instagram accounts, and the sort of visual aspect of minimalism that gets sort of, flown around there. I think it might have even, I don't know if it was at the same time Real Simple magazine came out. I don't know. But like that whole notion was relatively new, or it hadn't even started yet. So really the motivations were different. But that said, it can really fit into lots of different motivations. I mean, it's just practical, super practical. What works and what's easy. And often what's easiest is not to go to the store and buy something. It's to just use something that you already have sitting around the house.
Right. And it may feel easy in the short term, especially in the Amazon age. Oh, let me just get another thing. Let me just ship another thing. But that only works for a month and then you're drowning in boxes.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there are a few things where shipping the new thing via Amazon Prime really is the easiest thing to do.
Yes.
and hooray for Amazon Prime. Thank goodness for grocery deliveries and things like that. it's not always the easiest thing to do. And so I think the other thing about parent hacks, it's sort of subtext, is that there are lots of right ways to do things. And so what's right for me may not be right for you. If somebody wants to get a really big baby bouncer and it's their baby's favorite toy ever and it's saved their life, great. Like that's a story that should be told. So there are no hard and fast rules here. The idea is you, believe it or not, have really great ideas. You may just not know it until you actually need to use it. And then when you're able to share those ideas, it helps other people. And they're just different, different things work for different people. And there were plenty of hacks that would get published and, some proportion of people would say, that's genius, that's life-changing. And another portion of people would say, that's terrible. I would never do that. Like,
Right.
That wouldn't even help me. Why don't you just do it this way? And then the conversation would continue. And always so many good ideas came out of it.
It's so true because there are so many different types of humans and there's so many different types of living and the complexity, like, oh, you do it this way, I do it this way. I think that's one of the things I've really appreciated over the last decade. I think that there's been more space in the conversation around motherhood for many different versions of it. We're just starting to break out into this space of like, there are lots of different options and it's not all black and white. It's not all good or bad.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that did not feel present when I was a new parent. It really feels present now. And actually, it's sort of funny that we're talking about this because before I wrote Parent Hacks, I co-wrote a book called Minimalist Parenting with Christine Koh, who I now co-host a podcast with called Edit Your Life. That's exactly what that's about. I mean, that is the sort of underlying idea there, which is that there are many ways to do things. And the way to figure out which way is right for you is to really first start cluing into what your own values are and your own priorities and trusting yourself about that rather than sort of getting distracted by what everything outside of you is telling you should do.
How do you do that? Is there a theme or a way that you have learned over time? I mean, I know it takes many years of practice to allow yourself to listen more to your own advice and to your own experience. And how do you weigh that against all of the helpful advice to noise that can exist out there?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it is literally a daily practice because every situation that comes at you that requires decision making requires you to go through that process of like, okay, what am I hearing? What am I reading? And how am I feeling about this? And then comparing all of those things. And sometimes what you're reading is going to win out. And sometimes what you're feeling and what your gut's telling you is going to win out. I think the thing that maybe helps in terms of a reminder is to just give all three of those things weight. Don't discount what your gut is telling you or what your experience is telling you. I think that's the thing is that a lot of us just toss that aside or put it in like very low third place, prioritizing the things that either we're seeing around us or we're reading. And then we forget to remember that we actually have expertise. We may not have knowledge, but we actually have experience and we have history, and not to mention the fact that we know the kid better than anyone. That doesn't feel the same as knowing the answer. Knowing your kid doesn't mean you're going to always know the answer. In fact, most of the time we don't know the answer. We just have to try
Yes.
our best with what we've got and then see how it goes and then adjust and course correct. I have to remind myself all the time. I just went through the whole college application process with my son, that whole process of, researching colleges and applying and deciding and blah, 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 helping him with that, really trying to step back and let him take the lead while also being supportive. And I kept having to say this to myself because just like with new parenting, there's tons of info out there, tons of advice, tons of ways to spend your money on things that, do you really need to spend your money on things? Like, do you need to hire professionals to help you with this? Maybe some people do, maybe some people don't. But again, it was one of those huge things that required lots of gut navigation, but it was hard to trust, really hard to trust. So it's a daily practice that you keep having to come back to time and time again. And some percentage of times you'll get it right. And then plenty of times you just won't and you'll forget and you'll feel bad about yourself. That's just life, isn't it? Really?
Yes.
I mean, seriously, it's just life.
Every day. Every day is a new day. I also want to shift and ask you about the career side of your life and how you have navigated building this writing portfolio and this online presence and this podcast and your early days in web work. What has that looked like over time, and how have you carved out your own career to work for you?
So that's such an interesting question, and the answer's changed so many times over the years. But before I even answer you, I'm going to say that next to all of these things that I'm going to say, it's important to know that I am married to a person who has a job. So, we are a 2-income family, and let me just be honest, mostly his income. So, he has been well employed, and I've been very fortunate in that respect that like the way that our careers have worked, we both had enough flexibility that, sometimes he can work more and I can work less, and I can work more and he can work less. But the fact that there was this stabilizing income allowed me to take a lot more creative license with my own career. I think my answers would be really different if I were the prime income earner or if I were a single parent and the only income earner. So I think it's really important to say that because sometimes, it's like, oh, well, I just followed my heart. And well, I mean, that is true, but that's because, there was some measure of stability in my, household making that possible. So let me just say that.
Thanks for saying that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's really important. My career, and I always seem to use air quotes when I say that word, has been a really intuitive process. Even when I graduated from college, I thought I wanted to be in human resources because I thought that, work-life balance was such an interesting sort of sociological concept. I was really interested in it. Still am, actually. But I just kept getting offered really interesting jobs, and I would take them. So my career, was very much like, hopping on rocks, crossing a river. It was like, oh, that looks interesting. I'm going to go there. And then from that vantage point, oh, that's an interesting opportunity. I'll go there. And so that's really the story of my career. I've always been a writer. I mean, I've always loved writing. But when I actually sent in my first book proposal, it was after my husband and I had quit our jobs and packed up all our stuff and gone traveling for a while. And we came back and it was like, well, now what are we going to do? And my husband was like, wow, there's this cool thing like the internet. It's really cool. Back in, like 94, 95. And that was just, the bare beginnings of the web. And then it was like, well, maybe I can write a book about web pages. My husband was like, honey, people are going to want to be able to create websites. And I said, who's ever going to want to create a website? And he says, I'm telling you, this is going to be big. He literally said that to me. And I was like, okay, whatever. Sure. I'm not the visionary in the family. But I thought, oh, this is interesting. So I proposed a book and a publisher said yes. And that started my writing career. So, I mean, I can keep telling you stories like that. Like I did this thing and this thing happened and then I ran with it. It was the same sort of thing when I started this blog. I started a blog at a time when it just happened to be a moment where it was before blogs were commercial in any way. There was enough critical mass that there was an audience out there. I didn't go around trying to build a platform. The platform built itself because we were a community and it just went on from there. I wish I had practical steps that I could tell people like, this is what I did. And, here's what you can learn from it. But really, it has been very much a sort of a zigzag process, generally navigated through intuition.
I think that's more and more becoming true for so many people, this portfolio of projects and iteration and trying things out. What's next for you? Like, do you have a sense of what's on the horizon over the next 2 to 4 years, especially as these kids go to college?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've gotten very politically active. And so this is really interesting because I went on a really fabulous book tour with Parent Hacks when it came out. And it was such an amazing experience, to really connect with people across the country, around this book to sort of celebrate this community and this book. And finally, it was this chance to actually meet in person with people. And when I came home from that, huge like event in my life, I realized that my internet life had such a big presence in my day-to-day workings. I wanted actually to create a more local life. I wanted to create a Portland community. I wanted to sort of bring things a little closer to home. And so as it happened, my book tour ended pretty much the same day as the presidential election in 2016. And that was a moment for me that was very clarifying. I decided to create a community around being civically engaged. And I had never been politically active before, beyond voting. But I realized that, this is our democracy. We have a voice in it. And I wanted to encourage other people and sort of do that with other people, not unlike with Parent Hacks. When I was in a place of needing a community to do this thing with, this hard thing, same exact thing. And so I have found myself part of a really amazing community of women here in Portland who are getting involved in democracy, calling their representatives, encouraging people to vote, helping register voters. I mean, it's a pretty inspiring place to be, I got to say. This is something I never expected to do, but it's what I'm doing. I feel like it is the most important thing I can be doing right now, and I feel really proud of it. And I'm meeting women here in Portland that I never would have met otherwise, and it makes me really, really proud. So that's what I'm doing right now. But, beyond that, that's not all I want to do. Interestingly enough, I actually want to go back to sort of old school blogging because I feel like in many ways, social media sort of hollowed out that space for personal storytelling. I mean, great personal storytelling happens in social media, on Instagram and Facebook, but it's part of a stream that just goes away. There's something about a blog, which is more like inviting people over to your house rather than posting something on Facebook, which is sort of tossing something into the stream. And I feel like, I don't know, I want to sort of add my voice to that and tell some stories now that my kids are older and I'm talking about other things rather than parenting. I think that's what I want to do. Not sure where that's going to lead, but everything leads somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I trust that at this point.
So the last question I want to ask you, and I think it's often a challenge for people when I ask this question, but I'm curious what comes to mind, is about all of the things that we as parents or as workers don't do. And I've asked a lot of different guests, what don't you do? And one of them was like, actually, I don't fold laundry. We don't even put laundry away in drawers. We just keep it in hampers and you just pull it in. And I said, wow, it's in the Parent Hacks ethos. So what don't you do in either parenting or in your work life?
Okay. That is really great question. Well, one thing I don't do and I never have done is sign my kids up for a million things to do in the summer. That is one thing I don't do, or after school for that matter. I really have let them sort of lead the way in terms of what they want to spend their free time doing. And that is a wonderful thing. And it's not uncomplicated. I mean, sometimes people, stare at their computer for a long time and we have to sort of deal with that. And that's a problem. But that's one thing I don't do. Let's see. What else don't I do? That is a hard question to answer. And you even prep me for that one. And I'm like, how do I answer that?
It's hard because it usually ends up being ingrained. Like we don't actually consider where we've already made voids in our life. And then people email me the next day, oh, here, this is the thing I don't do. But like socialization, cooking, bedroom, housekeeping, chores, like all of those things. Or in work, do you go to a lot of events? I'm always curious.
Oh, yeah, that's so true. I have gone to a lot of events over the years. This last year, I very mindfully said, no, I'm not traveling. I'm not really going to events because I wanted to hang out here during my son's senior year of high school. I wanted to just be present because one thing that I've learned is that with teenagers, you don't really get to decide, when you have quality time. It's not like, oh, I've got 15 minutes right now. Come on, let's sit and discuss the meaning of life. That's just not how it works. Unlike with little kids, you can say, okay, it's playtime, and your kid will faithfully come and play and hang out, and, you can decide when to read books. With teenagers, I have found that it's much better to just sort of be present and around when something happens to come up. I mean, and it's not always possible, but it was possible for me this year. So that was one thing I did not do. I think another thing that I don't do when it comes to work and online stuff is I do not go out there and try to, optimize my website and create viral posts and, sort of think about what I'm doing online to grow my presence or platform. I don't think about it in those numerical terms. I think about it in connection terms. So I really think about what can I offer that actually either helps somebody or creates a connection with somebody? Not what can get, 1,500 shares. I don't think that is the only way to live your life online if you're trying to build an online business, because obviously, those details are really important, especially if you're, tracking the income and all that stuff. But I just think that the importance of that connection, that human connection, especially right now when people are feeling disconnected and people are mistrusting social media and the internet and sort of wondering, what are the algorithms doing to what I'm seeing? What is actually real and what isn't? The more we can be real with each other and actually connect with each other on that level, that's still where the magic of the internet can be. So that's something I think that's worth talking about.
Oh, I love that so much because we just launched this podcast less than a year ago, and I had a lot of conversations about how I was going to measure success. And measurement is useful, but it can also be beguiling. Like it can really deceive you in some ways. And my husband and I talked about measuring in thank you notes, measuring in people actually taking the time to send us a note. And it's made all the difference.
Oh, that's genius. I mean, that is really, really, really lovely. Sometimes you find out that, your work has had an effect on somebody and you just, there's no way you could have ever known. And I realize that sounds very idealistic. It's not necessarily going to be somebody's business plan, but I think it's really important to think about it and realize that that's also what gives us energy to keep creating stuff, realizing that if we treat our audience as numbers, then we become numbers and we don't feel human either. It just doesn't have to be like that. There's a balance there.
I love that so much. Thank you for joining us on this show and for telling us all about parent hacks and what your life looks like. Where can people find the book and find the blog or blogs that you're working on?
Wonderful. Well, the book is available at your favorite independent bookseller, also available online at Amazon. Love those independent bookstores, and it really is pretty well stocked all over the place. So, have a look there. The book is called Parent Hacks. If you want to find out more about it, my blog is parenthacks.com. But really where all the action is on our podcast. I would say that's where I'm really focusing my attention now. And that podcast is called Edit Your Life. And if you go to edityourlifeshow.com, you can see everything that we're up to. You can listen to episodes, and then you can go ahead and fire up your podcast player and subscribe.
It's a really good podcast. I just listened to the Serendipity replay that you did. I highly recommend. I'll put it in the show notes on this one for everyone listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been great, and you ask really wonderful questions.
And I always say this, and I mean it. Leave us a review on iTunes if you like our show. It takes a few seconds, and it really does help us a lot. If you want more of what we're talking about, go over to startuppregnant.com and get on our email list. We send out a weekly newsletter with time-saving tips for parents and entrepreneurs. And I always include a weekly gadget or tool or something awesome that we've stumbled upon to help make your life just a little bit easier. And as always, you can reach out to us at hello@startuppregnant.com. We love hearing from you.